My brother thought he had outsmarted everyone in that room. I could see it in the way he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a barely concealed smile tugging at the corner of his mouth while Mr. Patterson read through the pages of my father's will. Derek had been waiting for this moment for years, and when it finally came, he got exactly what he wanted: the house, the savings account, the truck, and every piece of furniture inside those walls. I got the keys to a building I had never once set foot in. A storage unit. A boarded-up, 3,000-square-foot eyesore on the edge of town that my father had purchased 30 years ago and apparently never sold. My brother looked at me with something that wasn't quite pity. It was closer to satisfaction. "You can probably sell it for the land value," he said, dropping the second set of keys onto the table in front of me like he was doing me a favor. "Maybe 10, 15,000 if you're lucky." I picked up those keys and I didn't say a word. "My name is Nora. I am 29 years old. For the past 4 years, I drove 40 minutes each way, 3 times a week, to sit beside my father while he went through dialysis. I brought him meals. I sorted his medications. I slept on his couch more nights than I can count because he was afraid to be alone in the dark after his first hospitalization. I watched the color go out of him slowly, like a lamp being turned down on a dimmer switch, until one morning in February, he was simply gone. Derek flew in from Seattle. He stayed for the funeral and for the reading of the will, and then he had a flight booked for the Sunday after. He hadn't visited once in 4 years, not once. His wife Cassandra stood in the corner of Mr. Patterson's office with her fingers wrapped around a coffee cup, wearing the kind of expression people wear when they are pretending not to be pleased with themselves. She had been angling for my father's house since the day they got married. I had heard her mention the guest room situation and the location and the market value at enough family dinners to understand exactly what she was hoping for. Now she had it. I drove out to the storage unit that same afternoon. I almost didn't go. The sky was doing that thing it does in March in Ohio, where it can't decide between rain and snow and settles for a gray, heavy nothing that presses down on everything. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a gas station for 20 minutes just holding the keys. Then I drove out. The building sat at the end of a gravel road off Route 9, past the old grain elevator that had been converted into apartments and a farm supply store that had been closed since I was in middle school. There was nothing remarkable about it from the outside. The siding had gone from white to a dingy beige. 2 of the front windows were covered with plywood. There was a padlock on the door that took me 4 tries to open because my hands were cold and I was fighting the feeling that none of this mattered anyway. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Old wood, something faintly metallic. Dust so thick I could feel it in the back of my throat. I stood in the doorway and I let my eyes adjust. It was not empty. I had expected empty. I had expected concrete floor and bare shelves and maybe some broken down equipment. What I found instead were rows. Wooden shelves built floor to ceiling along every wall and down the center of the room in 2 long aisles, the way a library is arranged. And on those shelves were boxes, hundreds of them, flat boxes, stacked carefully, each one labeled in my father's handwriting. A pegboard on the far wall held tools I didn't recognize. There were glass display cases under a tarp near the back, the kind you see in jewelry stores, and beside them a steel safe the size of a washing machine bolted to the floor. I walked to the nearest shelf and pulled down a box. Inside, wrapped in acid-free paper sleeves, were coins. Not loose change, not a jar of quarters. These were coins in individual protective holders, each one labeled with a date and a mint mark and a grade. I didn't know anything about coins. I had no idea what I was looking at. I put the box down carefully and opened the one next to it. More coins. And the one beside that. I walked the length of the shelf and pulled open box after box, and every single one contained the same thing, organized with the kind of meticulous care my father applied to everything he loved. I stood in the middle of that room for a long time. Why had he never told me about this? Why had he never mentioned it? I thought about all those drives out to dialysis, all those evenings at his kitchen table. He had talked to me about everything, about my mother, about his childhood, about the town and the people and the seasons and what he thought happened after you died. But never this. I walked to the back wall and found a small desk tucked beside a metal filing cabinet. The top drawer was unlocked. Inside there was a ledger, the old kind with columns and handwritten entries. The first entry was dated 1000, $987. The most recent was dated 11 months ago, 3 months before he got too sick to drive. I sat down on an overturned crate and I read. My father had been collecting for over 30 years. He started with coins, then expanded into vintage pocket watches, then antique jewelry, then rare stamps. He had bought quietly, carefully, from estate sales and auctions and private dealers, always paying under market value, always storing everything here. He never displayed any of it. He never talked about it. He had documented every single acquisition in this ledger with a purchase price and a note that said Est, current value beside each entry. I turned to the last page of the ledger. At the bottom, in my father's handwriting, was a total estimated value. My hands went still. The number written there was $4.3 million. I sat with that number for what felt like a very long time. The cold was coming through the walls and I could hear wind moving through the gap under the door. Outside it had started to snow. And I thought about my brother in my father's warm house, with my father's truck in the driveway, sleeping in the bedroom my father had painted himself the summer before he got sick. And I thought about the way Derek had slid those keys across the table like they were a consolation prize, like I should be grateful. I locked the building and I drove home, and I did not call my brother. The first person I called was a woman named Dr. Elaine Marsh, a numismatist at the university in Columbus whose name I found after an hour of research. I explained what I had found as factually as I could. She asked me to describe several of the coins in detail. When I got to the third one, she went quiet for a moment. "I'd like to come see this in person," she said. "Can you make yourself available this week?" She came on Thursday. She brought a colleague. They spent 6 hours in the building. I watched them work through maybe a third of the shelves, handling each piece with gloves, conferring quietly, making notes on their tablets. At the end of the afternoon, Dr. Marsh sat down across from me and folded her hands. "Your father had exceptional taste," she said, "and exceptional patience. Some of what's here I would need more time to fully assess, but what I can tell you now is that your conservative floor estimate, assuming everything is as catalogued, is somewhere between $3.5 and $5 million. Certain individual pieces, the $1,804 silver dollar if it grades the way it appears, the pocket watch collection, the stamps in the back cases, those alone could generate significant interest from serious collectors." I wrote down everything she said. I thanked her. I locked the building and drove home in the dark. I did not sleep that night. The question I couldn't stop turning over was the same one that had been sitting in my chest since the day I opened that door. Why the storage unit? Why leave it to me with no explanation? No note attached to the will. Nothing. My father was not a careless man. He didn't do things without reasons. I went back the next morning, and I went through the desk again, more carefully. In the back of the bottom drawer, under a stack of auction receipts, there was an envelope. My name was written on the front in his handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He had written that he started collecting the year my mother left. He needed something to do with his hands and his mind, something quiet that required attention. Over time, it became more than that. He wrote that he had always intended to tell me, but he kept waiting for the right moment, and the right moment kept not arriving. And then he got sick, and he was afraid if he told me I would try to sell it to pay for his care, and he didn't want that. He wrote that he left it to me because I was the one who showed up. Not because the others didn't love him, he was careful to say that, but because I was the one who was there, and the things we love should go to the people who show up. He wrote, "Take your time, don't rush, and don't let anyone push you into anything." I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope, and I held it for a moment. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Rebecca Cole. She had been recommended to me by a friend who had gone through a difficult divorce and said Rebecca was someone who did not flinch. I drove to her office that same afternoon and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked several very specific questions about the will, the building's title, and the probate status. Then she told me what I needed to hear. "The building and its contents are yours, legally and completely," she said. "The will is clear. Your brother has no claim." "I know," I said. "But I want to be ready." She looked at me. "Ready for what?" "He's going to find out," I said. "And when he does, he's going to try something." She nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure you're protected before that happens." We spent the rest of the week moving fast. I had the building's locks changed and a security system installed. Rebecca filed the paperwork to transfer the property title fully into my name. I had Dr. Marsh return with her full team to complete the assessment and begin formal appraisal documentation. I opened a new bank account at a different bank than the one my father had used, the one where Derek had been a joint account holder on the estate checking account. I moved carefully. I moved quietly. I was not quiet enough. On a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the will reading, my phone rang. It was Derek. "I heard you had some people out at the storage unit," he said. His voice was pleasant in the way a door is pleasant before it swings shut on your fingers. "I've been looking through Dad's things," I said. "And? Anything interesting?" "Some old equipment," I said. "Tools. A lot of boxes." There was a pause. "Nora." His voice had shifted. "You know, I've been thinking. Dad's estate there might be assets that weren't fully accounted for in the will. Things that were overlooked. I think we should sit down and talk about whether everything was divided fairly." "The will was pretty clear," I said. "Wills can be contested," he said. I had been expecting this. Since the moment Dr. Marsh said the words $3.5 to $5 million. I kept my voice even. "If you have concerns about the estate," I said, "you should speak with your attorney. Mine is Rebecca Cole." I hung up. He called 3 more times that day. I didn't answer. The next morning there was a certified letter from an attorney in Seattle. The letter alleged that my father had not been of sound mind in the final year of his life, and that the will should be contested on grounds of undue influence. The letter specifically named me as having exercised that influence. I sat at my kitchen table and I read that letter twice. I thought about 4 years of sitting in a dialysis waiting room. I thought about the medication log I kept in a spreadsheet, color-coded by day and time. I thought about my father's voice the night he called me at 2 in the morning because he had a cramp in his leg and he was scared, and I drove 40 minutes in the dark to sit with him until morning. I scanned the letter and emailed it to Rebecca. Her response came back within an hour. She had been expecting this too. She had already begun gathering documentation, my father's medical records, statements from his physicians, the dialysis center's records. She had contacted 2 of his doctors who were willing to provide written statements that he had been fully competent until the final weeks of his illness. She had the letter from the drawer, which I had photographed and given to her, establishing my father's intent in his own handwriting. "They're going to have a very difficult time proving this in court," she wrote. "But I want you to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better." It got worse. Cassandra started calling people we knew. Mutual friends, neighbors of my father's, people from his church. She told them she was concerned that I had been isolating my father and that things had been taken from the estate. One of my father's neighbors called me to tell me what Cassandra had said and to let me know she thought it was disgraceful. I thanked her and wrote her name down as a potential character witness. Derek filed the formal contest 2 weeks later. Rebecca filed our response the same afternoon. The appraisal came back the following week. The total assessed value of the contents of the building was $4,840,000. The 1,804 silver dollar graded MS-62 by PCGS. The pocket watch collection alone was assessed at over $300,000. Dr. Marsh called me herself to deliver the number, and her voice had the contained excitement of someone who has spent a career waiting to see something this rare. "Your father was extraordinary," she said. "I know," I said. 2 weeks before the court date, Derek's attorney called Rebecca with a settlement offer. Derek would drop the contest in exchange for 50% of the appraised value of the building's contents. Rebecca called me to relay the offer. I could hear her being very careful about how she presented it, being neutral, being professional. "What do you want to do?" she asked. I thought about the letter in the envelope. "Take your time, don't rush, and don't let anyone push you into anything." "Nothing," I said. "We go to court." The hearing lasted 2 days. Derek's attorney presented their theory of undue influence. They had found one home health aide who had worked with my father briefly and was willing to say she had seen me controlling his communications, by which she meant I had set up his phone's voice assistant when his hands started shaking too badly to type. Rebecca dismantled this methodically. She presented the medical testimony. She presented the letter. She presented 4 years of documented visits, the dialysis records, the pharmacy receipts, The voicemails I had saved from my father's phone, including one from 18 months before he died, in which he described, in his own voice, why he intended to leave the building to me. The judge ruled in my favor completely. Derek and Cassandra flew back to Seattle the day after the ruling. He did not call me. He did not send a message. I heard through a mutual family friend that the legal fees had been significant, and that they had refinanced the house, my father's house, to cover them. I didn't feel satisfaction about that exactly. I felt something quieter, something that was mostly just tired. I drove out to the building on the Saturday after the ruling. It was April by then, and the light was different, thinner, cleaner, the kind of light that makes everything look newly built. I unlocked the door and I walked to the back of the room and I sat down at my father's desk. I had already begun the process of working with Dr. Marsh to identify the best path forward for the collection. Some pieces would go to auction. Some, the ones my father had written about most tenderly in his ledger, I intended to keep. A significant coin dealer out of Chicago had already made contact about private acquisition of several key pieces. Rebecca had introduced me to a financial advisor who specialized in managing sudden asset liquidity. Everything was moving carefully, exactly the way my father would have wanted. I opened the ledger to the first page. 1,987. A Morgan silver dollar. Purchase price $14 at a garage sale in Dayton. Estimated current value, he had written, $450. He had started with $14. I thought about him driving out here in 1987, a young man with a bad marriage and a baby daughter, and a head full of things he couldn't say to anyone. I thought about him locking the door behind him and opening a box and carefully, slowly, building something in the silence. Something no one knew about. Something that was entirely his. Something, he decided, at the end of everything, to give to me. I closed the ledger and I sat in the quiet of that room for a long time. The light came through the gap in the boarded window in a narrow slant and caught the dust moving in the air, and for a moment everything was very still. I had grown up thinking that the way to earn love was to make yourself useful, make yourself small, stay and help, and never ask for anything in return. I had lived 4 years, as if my presence were a transaction. I give care, I receive approval. I had stood in a lawyer's office and watched my brother take everything while I held 2 keys to a padlock and told myself it was fine. It wasn't a transaction. It never was. My father knew what he was doing. He had 30 years of practice doing quiet, careful things for reasons that wouldn't be understood until later. He left me the building because he knew me well enough to know I would open the door. I stood up. I put the ledger back in the drawer. I walked to the front of the building and I pulled the plywood off one of the windows so the light could come in. Then I took out my phone and I called Dr. Marsh. "I'm ready to start," I said. The auction was held in June in New York. I flew out for it. I sat in the back of the room and watched people bid on things my father had carried home in paper bags and cardboard boxes, things he had unwrapped alone in this building in a small Ohio town, while the rest of the world moved past not knowing. The $1,804 sold for $620,000. The room made a sound when the hammer came down. I did not cry. I sat very still, and I let the number settle into me. Afterward, in the hotel, I called the dialysis center in Millbrook where my father had spent so many afternoons. I had already spoken with their development director once, a preliminary conversation. Now I told her I wanted to fund a patient comfort fund, something for people who couldn't afford the small things that make a long afternoon bearable. Books and blankets and decent food in the waiting room. She was quiet for a moment. "That's a beautiful thing," she said. "It's not mine," I said. "It's his." I drove back to Millbrook the following week. The building was still there at the end of the gravel road off Route 9, same as always. I had hired someone to repair the siding and replace the windows. And the place was already looking different, more solid, more like it intended to stay. I walked the aisles one more time, running my hand along the empty shelves where the boxes had been, the shelves my father had built himself out of good wood that had not warped in 30 years. There were still pieces left here, the ones I had decided to keep. A pocket watch that had belonged to my grandfather. A small coin, the first one he ever bought, still in its original paper envelope with the price written on it in pencil. $14. I put it in my pocket. Outside, the sky was doing its Ohio thing, blue and vast and slightly too bright, the kind of sky that asks you to pay attention. I locked the door. I stood in the gravel for a moment with the sun on my face. My brother thought he had won. He got the house and the truck and the savings account and the furniture, and he went home to Seattle satisfied, convinced he had read the situation correctly. He had looked at 2 keys to a padlock and seen nothing worth having. That was the thing about my father. He had spent 30 years understanding that the most valuable things don't announce themselves. They sit quietly in the dark and they wait for the person who will bother to open the door. I walked to my car. The gravel crunched under my feet. The building stood solid and ordinary in the spring light, same as it always had, the same building it had always been. I was the only one who knew what it held. I pressed the accelerator and I pulled out onto Route 9 and I drove toward the light.